Miami's offseason could be a tumultuous one, so we're joined by HoopsHype insider Michael Scotto to talk about free agents Haywood Highsmith and Caleb Martin, the latest on Jimmy Butler and Donovan Mitchell, and the latest buzz on superstars around the league. All that and more on today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Heat, your everyday podcast on the Miami Heat, whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day, Monday to Friday. I'm Wes Goldberg, editor at allyoucanheat.com, here with David Ramil, both of us credentialed Heat media members. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. We're excited to be joined today by HoopsHype senior NBA insider Michael Scotto, who's going to help us talk about this offseason. Michael, you recently had a conversation with Haywood Highsmith for your podcast. You got into his upcoming free agency decision and all those things. But before we get to that, you also asked him about Heat culture, and he described it as, quote, a place that's not for everybody. A lot of people can't stick it out because they're not mentally and physically strong enough. And, you hear that a lot, that we're not for everybody kind of thing. When you talk to people around the league, because that's your job, do you believe that, they believe that Heat culture is sort of a thing? Are people rolling their eyes at it? Like, when you hear these kinds of quotes out there about what's going on in Miami, how do you think it's being perceived around the league?
Well, certainly, I guess the simple answer is yes, Heat culture is a thing. I mean, as far as what Haywood mentioned about being mentally and physically tough enough, they obviously, want guys in the best shape possible, and they push everybody to be in that shape. I think they've done a great job. The biggest thing when you talk to people around the league about the Heat and about Heat culture is their player development system. And for them, it's really been incredible to see how they find these diamond in the rough guys that, whether it's an undrafted guy, maybe a guy coming off a lower value elsewhere, and they prop them up, but they find guys that become valuable rotation players for themselves and at a cheap cost, which is extremely important in the new CBA and how you're structuring rosters going forward. And they maximize them. And then it's ironic because some guys leave and they don't always perform as well as they did with the Heat. I think Max Strus performed well, but obviously recently, Gabe Vincent was hurt. So there's a bit of an asterisk there. But, in general, Miami seems to get the most out of their guys. Now, I don't know if that's the warm weather, feeling good on their joints, the culture, and some of the coaching development. Maybe it's the women in Miami. I don't know. And I think it all certainly plays a role. Anytime I see Pat Riley, the guy looks like he could still coach the New York Knicks from like 30 years ago or whatever it was. I forget now. But Heat culture is a thing within the league. And it's just more about how they go about developing guys, pushing them to their limit and maximizing them. And I truthfully think Haywood was very candid and honest with his answer, which I appreciated, about having the mental fortitude and toughness to play for the Heat. And I truthfully think you need that for a lot of teams in the league. Obviously with a guy like, I think Tom Thibodeau, you need the right kind of player. Certain teams are going to need that. But with Miami in particular, I think he was spot on and candidly honest with that evaluation.
And Highsmith, obviously a product of that player development program. He's going to be a free agent this year. He was on a cheap contract, and it does not look like he's going to be on a cheap contract anymore. ESPN's Bobby Marks kind of analyzed it, guesstimates $8 to $10 million a year. Haywood told you he's even thinking maybe $10 to $15 million a year. He sort of dropped that number in there, got that one out there. Is this number realistic for Highsmith?
Which one?
Either one. Like, where do you kind of guesstimate it? Like between $8, $15 million? I mean, either way, it's a big pay raise.
Well, I'll start with this. I would say Haywood has a lot of interest around the league from teams because of the prototype that he fits, which is a 3-and-D guy. Shot 40% this year from three, which is a high watermark for teams around the league. Defensively, you guys know in Miami, him being the locksmith, really his wingspan at 7'1" allows him to guard some of the best players in the league, whether it's Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, who they've gone up against a bunch, and even Jalen Brunson on the Knicks. Like, he's always guarding the top perimeter player. And in a league where, there hasn't been as much of an emphasis on defense, you need guys like that to win. And the thing about Haywood, given his humble journey to get here, this is a guy that played overseas a little bit, got his start with the Sixers, came to the Heat during the COVID time period and worked his way through a bunch of 10 days and progressed after that. He's a guy that is humble. He's not going to be demanding a lot of shots. He's going to play his role and do what a team needs to win, which in a locker room and in a culture for any team, that's highly valued. As far as his range, I think anything is applicable there. Certainly I've known Bobby Marks a long time. I've known Bobby since he was with Brooklyn. I'm based here in Brooklyn, so we've known each other, almost 15 years probably. And so, with Bobby, I trust Bobby's evaluation. Certainly I think 8 to 10 is reasonable, given the market, given the where the salary cap is going up with the new CBA deal coming in, and the TV rights. And, if Haywood can get, I don't know, I know he mentioned 10 to 15. I mean, anything is possible. Depends on the role a team is going to have for him. The biggest thing I think with Miami, and I'm sure we're going to touch on this, you look at who they have as free agents this summer, and you've got Caleb Martin, Haywood Highsmith. Certainly I expect Caleb Martin to hit the unrestricted free agency market. I think he's going to do that. So as far as those guys, I mean, if you're Miami, you probably have to pick between the two right now. I think if you're going to keep one of them and pay them, what the market could command, since both are available to sign anywhere they want. So I think Haywood's put himself in a great position, given his 3-and-D prototype and shooting that 40%, and just his reputation as far as being a good locker room guy around the league is going to help him.
You mentioned the Caleb Martin free agency, and it kind of plays out. It looks like it's going to play out anyway, similarly to what we saw last year when Miami had both Max Strus and Gabe Vincent hit free agency at the same time. They basically let Max walk, knowing that they could not afford whatever contract offers he was going to get. And they made a competitive offer for Vincent, but ultimately it was well short of what the Lakers were able to offer him. Do you think we could see something similarly this year, where Martin is probably the higher paid option around the league, and then Haywood kind of is a secondary option in terms of what contracts are offered to him? And given all things being equal, I think he mentioned this on your show too, he'd prefer to stay in Miami. But how likely is that he'd give up a significant amount of money to stay in Miami rather than other locations?
So I'll start with Caleb Martin first. As of now, I would project Caleb Martin to be a non-taxpayer mid-level kind of guy. That's my
million-ish. Yeah,
maybe a little more than that. Yeah, somewhere around that range.
Yeah.
I think if Caleb Martin was coming out a year before when he was on fire in the playoffs, totally different scenario. But, that's not the reality of the optics right now. So I would project him more that way. And especially too, if you want to be on a playoff caliber team with similar success like the Heat, generally a lot of those teams are, they don't use cap space, but they have that non-taxpayer mid-level. So I think he would have a bevy of interest from a bunch of those teams and be able to pick from there. Regarding Haywood Highsmith, I mean, look, essentially he did say if the offers are close, Miami has the edge. Mm-hmm. Now, I was not given a specific dollar amount of what the differential would be where he would look to, possibly go elsewhere. But, if it's a couple million maybe, then I think it's more of a decision once you get further past that. For a guy that has not had a chance yet to earn the big bucks comparatively that he's going to get most likely on the market and is certainly expected to. When you're a guy in his situation, you have to really look at taking the money. Again, if it's a short difference of a couple million, like maybe 1 or 2 million, something like that, 3, Like if it's $1 million a year or something like that, then
Right,
maybe it's a closer conversation. Maybe even if it's 2. But if it's more than that, and again, this is just my own interpretation. I think that he's got to really look at, is it worth it to get the bag? And lastly, you guys had mentioned about them letting go of Max Strus. Now, the difference with letting go of Max Strus, they had 2 shooters. They had Duncan Robinson still on the roster, and they felt that they can build up his value with those minutes, and he would be able to replace that production. When I look at the Heat roster, I don't necessarily at this moment see a top perimeter defender that you're going to put on the opponent's best player outside of Haywood Highsmith. And so I think that's going to be the difficulty. They have to weigh the pros and cons of that. Of the 2 players, you know, you can make the argument that they, from an optics standpoint, would have a better chance of keeping Haywood Highsmith if they come correct early in free agency and offer a fair market value number. But time will tell ultimately on that and which direction the Heat will want to go. For both players, they're going to have significant interest around the league. So they're great role players. As far as I know, good dudes in the locker room on background checks. So they should be in an advantageous position for sure.
It's a great point, and it felt like for a long time Haywood Highsmith was being groomed to replace Caleb Martin, and then the leap that he made this last year, it's like, oh, he almost is better than Caleb Martin in some stretches of the season. He was just flatly better than Caleb, and now if you're the Heat, at risk of losing both of these guys. You don't really have somebody in the pipeline to replace both of them. So I'm with you, but also very realistic that based on where Miami is against the second cap tax apron, that they could lose both of these guys. And so it's going to be some tough decisions. More tough decisions coming up in terms of Jimmy Butler's extension. We're going to talk about that next with HoopsHype's Michael Scotto.
Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. What's Prize Picks? Well, it's America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. It's the easiest and most exciting way to get in on all the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats, and you watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks is so easy. It's so simple to play. You can make your picks and submit an entry in less than 60 seconds. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types. That's what makes Prize Picks the #1 fantasy sports app. So download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA, that's LOCKEDONBA, and get a first deposit match of up to $100. So download the app today, use the code LOCKEDONNBA, and don't forget, Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. We'll be right back.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Make sure to follow Michael Scotto all offseason long for the latest around the league in terms of free agency, trades. You got a recent mock draft up with some intel in there. If you're interested,
a little bit of everything. Got it all.
A little bit of everything. Over all of it at HoopsHype. You can follow him on Twitter. We'll drop all that stuff in the show notes. Jimmy Butler is making it pretty known, and you don't need much reporting on this, that he wants a max contract extension. Sure. Pat Riley also making it publicly known through his end-of-season press conference that he's not in a hurry to negotiate a contract extension with Jimmy Butler. Meanwhile, you've got the Sixers over here making noise through the media that they're willing to give Jimmy Butler that max extension if Miami isn't. How real, Michael, do you think that it is that there are other teams, Sixers or otherwise, that are out there willing to pay Jimmy?
You know, it's funny. When all this stuff was going down, the first thing I could think of was Jimmy Butler going, Tobias Harris over me?
Yeah.
Tobias Harris? You know, that video was always infamous. But as far as teams around the league, I mean, look, certainly if Jimmy Butler became available, there'd be plenty of interest. But here's the thing. Jimmy, in an ideal world, wants to stay in Miami, wants to get the max extension. I get why Pat Riley wants to hold off a little bit. I think, first of all, he played 60 games last year. And, you know, they need to get more out of Jimmy during the regular season, I think, personally. I know they've made some deep playoff runs, and playoff Jimmy is a thing. I know maybe in the commercials he says no, but it is clearly a thing if you look at the statistics. Again, I think it's just posturing from both. One thing about Miami and Heat culture, especially with Pat Riley and Jimmy Butler, they speak their mind freely. The fact that it's a little bit more public, I guess that's where maybe the antenna around the league got raised a little bit. But you guys mentioned Philadelphia. First of all, I think if you're looking at teams around the league that who would want Jimmy Butler, I think you got to put the Sixers right at the top of the list. However, with that said, if you're the Sixers, ideally, I'm pretty confident they'd rather have Paul George as a free agent, just pay him the money and not have to give up assets in addition to paying the money as they would with Jimmy Butler. So that's the biggest thing to me when I look at that situation. And I think Paul George is an interesting case. And this all ties into Jimmy, because with Paul George, they have not, and I had touched on this on HoopsHype, and I know others have as well, but the Clippers have not come to Paul George with a higher contract offer than the 3-year, $153 million extension that they gave Kawhi Leonard. That extension is not a max contract, okay? For some listeners who may not know what the max value is, it's not. Paul George wants the max. And so I think that's where this gets interesting as a bit of a domino effect.
Right.
If Paul George is able to get the max from the Clippers and he's able to stay, or he takes a max elsewhere, but again, really more so from the Clippers, who want to ideally keep him. You know, they're going into the new arena. They want to keep James Harden. But if that happens, then that takes away an option from the Sixers. The Sixers then need to pivot. On the free agent market, then you have a bit of a domino effect. They could try to go after OG Anunoby and offer him a max contract. That's fine. The Knicks have the ability to do the same, even though they probably didn't necessarily think he would get that high. He certainly helped his value, but I can't stress enough that one of his agents at CAA is Leon Rose's son. And I would be logically and optically surprised if that didn't help steer things towards the New York Knicks. And OG had a great run with the Knicks. They played well as a team, and they're on the rise. Now that swings you over to Jimmy Butler, because then you're looking at probably the trade market. And, you know, it's ironic. I could see a team like even Philly looking at Haywood Highsmith too. And you know, as a guy that used to be in that organization as a role player, but big picture in terms of Jimmy, like, then you got to start looking at the trade market. And if you're going to land an impact player, they've got assets to, you know, make a trade. They obviously have a familiarity with Jimmy Butler. And so ideally they're going to want to have like a good big three. And it's Joel Embiid, Tyrese Maxey, and who's that third guy? If Jimmy Butler's your third guy, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And that gives you a real shot to compete in an Eastern Conference where the Celtics pretty much dominated for most of the regular season, and they're going to the championship now. So I expect a lot of, in general around the NBA, while it's a weaker free agency class, that usually means comparatively than other years where there's no like superstar. Usually that means there's going to be more big game hunting across the league via trade talk. And so that's what's going to be interesting. Ultimately, a little bit of posturing on both sides. Big question, though, is Jimmy Butler. We've seen when Jimmy Butler doesn't get what he wants in Minnesota. And I'll go with ornery or something. You know, he was clearly peeved.
Putting it mildly,
Yeah, that's, and I definitely put it mildly. I've thought of other adjectives, but it was a major problem and a distraction. And for the Heat, they're still good enough to be a good team. You don't want to have that distraction, but I get the domino. I see you shaking your head, but I still think they're a good team. I still think they're a good team. I know they weren't like in the regular season this year, but I think Spo is, if he's not the best coach in the NBA, he's definitely top 5 at the absolute worst. Like, I think Eric Spoelstra, like, throughout his career, this guy is criminally underrated. From what he did with LeBron coming out of the video room, and just he maximizes everything out of his guys in the playoffs when you're trying to win. You know, great schemes, great work ethic, all that stuff. So ultimately, I don't even know if I would call this like a storm. I think it's just maybe like a little bit of a cloud. Hopefully it passes. And Jimmy and Pat know what it is. Like, they both want the same thing, I think, ultimately. But there's just got to be a little bit of concessions. And I think ultimately they can get there if they both want it.
Well, you kind of, it brings me to my next question, because you kind of made it seem like a foregone conclusion that there would be a lot of interest around the league. And maybe it's just a very vocal minority here in South Florida, but I think there were a lot of fans and the organization itself that was frustrated with Jimmy's lack of availability and everything else like that. And the fact that he is getting older, there's a lot of mileage, there's the Tibbs factor, and who knows how soon we'll start to see the beginning of the end in terms of Jimmy's career, whether or not playoff Jimmy can even step up at any point in time in the future. So do you think that there is a concern around the league about Jimmy Butler's availability and his age, and whether or not those will play a factor? Or do you think that there will still be, when Miami, let's say it all goes badly for Miami, and I think a lot of us expect that it could, if that's the case and they wind up having to find a trade partner, you do think that there will be lots of teams that are going to be willing to accept them? Because you kind of have to be in the right situation. One, you can't afford to pay Jimmy, the max is a huge amount, and I don't know how many teams are going to be out there willing to pay that. But at the same time, he needs to be able to slide into a team where you're going to have other players carry the brunt of the offensive load. And how does he fit in? So how do you think that he's viewed in league circles around around the rest of the league?
Look, is Jimmy Butler going to play 82 games? No, he's not.
No.
But every team that's ever had him knows that. He's still a really good player and a high all-star caliber guy, an all NBA guy. I absolutely think there would be interest in Jimmy, and just because bottom line, you need guys that are proven players in the playoffs. And if you're a team that's contending, you want that guy. Like, I mean, oh my goodness.
But you imagine?
Can you imagine a guy like him, like just theoretically? And if you clip this, make sure I said theoretically, because I know the aggregators get excited. But like, could you imagine on a team like the Kings or something like that? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like a team that's looking to take the next step. But like I touched on Philly, there's plenty of teams that would want Jimmy Butler. Now, you got to have the right locker room to tolerate Jimmy, because Jimmy's a fiery guy, in your face guy. He's not a passive aggressive guy.
Oh,
that's more the optics I think teams would have to weigh. And
that's why I think a team like Philadelphia makes sense, because they've been there, done that. They know it. I think a team like the Golden State Warriors, they've dealt with a guy like Draymond Green. They know how to withstand these kinds of things. They know how to deal with the attention that somebody like Jimmy Butler can bring as well. Like, these are the teams that I like the idea of Sacramento. I've thought about it too. That would be like a desperate thing for Sacramento to do. Maybe not go in that direction. But I do think that I agree with you, Michael, a lot of teams that do make sense for Jimmy Butler, if they already have that 1A scorer who is going to play a majority of the games and carry the offense. And if you put Jimmy Butler in that situation, that's why – go ahead.
I was just going to say, guys, like, I get Jimmy Butler's a little older now, but if you're talking about another – depends. Like, if he does this extension, like another 2 years, and then you pick up the player option, there is value in having him for the next, like, I don't know.
It would be 3 years.
Seasons.
Yeah.
3 years out of that contract. Like, he's probably going to play at a high level at least like the next 2. And sometimes you got to do it. You got to give like that extra year. You do it to get the guy. Because if you don't, somebody else is going to. I assure you that.
And it gets you closer to where you want to go, but you have to have the right, like, for example, with the Miami Heat, the conversation here is, well, if you can go get that number one scoring option, it's why they've been trying to chase a superstar for the last few years, then it's worth actually paying Jimmy Butler the max, because you're opening up a title window. But it becomes a little bit more of a difficult decision if you don't have that top guy, and then you're paying Jimmy Butler like that top guy. And I think that's where Pat Riley was kind of coming from, in that we can't pay you like a top guy if you're only going to show up for if you're only going to play 60 games a year. That said, the Heat have been linked to guys like Donovan Mitchell, who is also in the midst of his own extension situation.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that next here on Locked On Heat. Back here with Locked On Heat. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. Joined by HoopsHype's NBA insider, Michael Scotto. What are you hearing on Donovan Mitchell?
As far as Donovan, I mean, look, Cleveland's going to come at him with a max contract extension. I think the number of years, I think the amount is what it is. It's a max contract. It's just whether it's 3 years, 4 years, however many, they would want. I'm pretty sure they would do whatever Donovan wants to do ultimately to keep him there. I believe I have to double check, but I believe if he did a 3-year extension, he'd be eligible for 10 years of service and then can get more money going forward. So I think that might be a middle ground for both sides. Obviously Kobe Altman talked in his presser after the end of the season availability and after making the change with JB Bickerstaff as coach that they've had great talks and he feels good about it. So ultimately we're going to find out one way or another soon enough. And I just think that it's just a wait and see thing. I don't want to say yet which way he's going to go because I still want to do more digging to confirm on it, but we're going to know sooner than later. And it's just a push come to shove moment for the franchise because this is a very black and white thing. He's either taking a max extension or he's not. And if he's not, you got to worry about, is this guy leaving? Because what's the holdup then? And then you got to make a decision. And, again, it's a domino effect. So with Donovan stays, right? You would look at that roster. I know Kobe Altman said they wouldn't necessarily need to have to trade Darius Garland, but you could. You got two bigs that, I know they played a 5 and a 4, and I think their plus minus was like a +5 overall, but you could move one of those two if you wanted to get a wing, maybe a small forward. They've got optionality, but it all starts with Donovan and what's happening with him. So I think that's it. I mean, here's the other thing I would say about this. Donovan could take an extension with the Cavaliers and then later on want out. We've seen it with plenty of stars. Doesn't mean anything. The only thing it would mean is that Cleveland would have better trade value going forward. I'm just saying it's a possibility. I mean, we've seen it plenty. Lord knows James Harden has done it. Ben Simmons, you name it. It's been done in the NBA. With any player, it's always secure the bag first, figure it out later. Always. And anybody that says otherwise is lying.
Are you buying into the optimism coming out of Cleveland that they can get him to sign that extension? Because it does kind of feel like, all right, if he doesn't sign the extension, then it's just because he doesn't want to be in Cleveland. He's going to get that extension anyway. He's going to be a max player regardless of where he goes. Right. But they're sounding more and more optimistic, like they're going to be able to keep him. I guess the reporting around the JB Bickerstaff situation is that they fired him in part because he didn't get along with Donovan Mitchell. Are you buying into that optimism?
You're certainly, if you're Cleveland, pushing your chips closer to the center of the table, thinking that way with the move they did. So, logically and optically, it's trending that way. I'm not sure how far the pendulum is swinging that way overall, but it is trending in that direction.
We heard recently from Brian Windhorst that Mitchell has the kind of power and influence in the Cleveland front office that rivals LeBron in Los Angeles. And that kind of took me back because I did not expect Mitchell to have that kind of control. Is that kind of aligned with what you've heard about Cleveland's front office and Mitchell's role in it? And on top of that, what other players around the league have that much control? Because I'm not sure that there are that many. Like I would have thought that LeBron was at the very top of that list. Is he? We're talking about trading him. I don't know that he is at the top of that list.
I think as far as, well, first of all, Kobe Altman publicly said that they value at the end of the season presser. Kobe Altman publicly said that they value his basketball knowledge. I think he's a smart player, which is like wink, wink. We take what he says seriously.
Right.
So around the league, I don't know. We'd have to go down a list and whatnot, but I'm not surprised. Like, given the market Cleveland's, and you got to listen to him. He's an all NBA player. That's how you get those guys. You got to trade for them in that market. Certain markets, that's just how it goes. With the Lakers and LeBron, I get it. Obviously the Knicks have become like the Villanova Knicks, but I don't know if Jalen Brunson's the one banging on the door doing that. I just think that any smart team is going to listen to some of the stuff with their top guys. Some stars are better GMs than others. That's what I would say. This isn't picking, like when they would pick the all-star team, and this is a little different.
Yeah.
So,
just give us one more name before you get out of here. Just a name that you're intrigued by. It doesn't have to be the top name. LeBron's, Paul George's. We could skip all that kind of stuff. A name that you're intrigued by in free agency or this offseason.
Oh, wow. A name I'm intrigued by. Intrigue me a couple. I think like Tobias Harris intrigues me because it seems like he's not going back to Philly. And I think he's a very serviceable guy who plays a lot of regular season games. I'm curious what his value is going to be ultimately. I think other guys that fascinate me, like Kentavious Caldwell-Pope.
That's a good one.
I think is a little underrated. Miles Bridges, his situation has always fascinated me because this is a guy that puts up like 20 and 7 and 3 across the board on a team in Charlotte. And you saw what happened with like PJ Washington when he left Charlotte and he went to a more win now ready team. Is there something like that out there for Miles? Time's going to tell. The center market's interesting to me. I gave more than one name. I don't care. The center market is like fascinating to me because you've got more of a traditional big in Jonas Valanciunas. You've got more modern day kind of rim roller guys and Isaiah Hartenstein and Nick Claxton. Are those guys going to get closer to 20 million or not? I think that's going to be interesting. And I'm still going to say, I think you've got to find guys like diamond in the rough guys like Haywood Highsmith if you're a team around the league. And that's a guy you're going to want to fill out your roster with. To, I think, the public, it may not be the quote-unquote sexiest name, but I promise you the teams that want to win, he's high on the board. And I think that's what you got to look at in this free agent market. A lot of guys that are key role players that are going to go to a team, have an immediate impact, fit in seamlessly with any locker room culture, and where you feel like you're going to get a defined role and know what you're getting.
Well, way to bring it all full circle at the very end. Michael Scotto, find him on Twitter, Michael A. Scotto, and you can read his work and hear his work over on HoopsHype. Mike, thanks so much for jumping on the show. We really appreciate it, man.
You got it, guys. My pleasure.